Boarding for Flight 882 to San Francisco had already begun when the man stepped into the aircraft. He was impossible not to notice, and yet somehow invisible at the same time. Very dark skin, tall, broad shoulders, posture straight but relaxed. He wore a plain charcoal hoodie, clean jeans, and sneakers that looked worn but carefully maintained. No jewelry, no designer logos, no signs that announced money or power. His boarding pass read seat 4A first class, but no one around him bothered to look at that detail long enough to believe it. People saw his skin first. They always did. The first-class cabin was full of quiet confidence, pressed suits, expensive handbags, low voices discussing deals and deadlines. When the man paused briefly to let a flight attendant finish helping another passenger, a woman across the aisle frowned. She was blonde, elegant, wrapped in a cream-colored coat that screamed wealth without saying a word. Her name was Elaine Parker, and she had spent most of her life believing she could tell who belonged where within seconds. To her, this man did not belong here. Elaine leaned toward the man sitting next to her and whispered, not softly enough, "Is first-class open seating now?" The man shrugged awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Elaine's eyes followed the dark-skinned man as he moved toward row 4. When he stopped at seat 4A, right by the window, Elaine stiffened. That was her row. She was in seat 4C, aisle. The empty middle seat suddenly felt like a border she hadn't agreed to share. "Excuse me," Elaine said sharply as the man placed his bag overhead. He turned, calm, polite. "Yes," he replied. His voice was deep, controlled, American. Not loud, not submissive, just steady. Elaine looked him up and down again, this time more openly. "I think you're in the wrong section," she said. Economy boarding is still happening. A few nearby passengers glanced over. The flight attendant froze for half a second, but said nothing yet. The man reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his boarding pass. He didn't wave it, didn't shove it in her face. He simply looked at it himself, then met her eyes. "Seat 4A, he said. "This is my seat." Elaine laughed, a short sound filled with disbelief. "That's impossible," she replied. "These seats are expensive." He nodded once. "Yes, they are." That answer irritated her more than if he had argued. The flight attendant finally stepped closer. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone professional but cautious. Elaine didn't hesitate. "Yes. I'm uncomfortable," she said. "I believe this passenger may be seated incorrectly." The attendant looked at the man. He handed over his boarding pass without a word. She scanned it. Her posture changed instantly. "You're in the correct seat, sir," she said. "Welcome aboard." She smiled at him. It was a genuine smile. Elaine noticed. That bothered her deeply. As the man sat down, Elaine shifted in her seat, pulling her coat closer as if space itself were being invaded. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "Airlines really are changing standards." The man said nothing. He placed his backpack under the seat, buckled his seatbelt, and looked straight ahead. He had learned long ago that silence unsettles people who expect resistance. Elaine expected resistance. She didn't get it. Other passengers watched quietly. A businessman 2 rows back raised an eyebrow. A woman across the aisle glanced between them, sensing tension. The man remained still, as if the cabin noise passed through him without leaving a mark. He had flown hundreds of times. He had seen this pattern before. First comes doubt, then entitlement, then escalation. He knew the rhythm better than the flight attendants knew their safety demonstration. Elaine pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. She leaned slightly away from him, angling her body toward the aisle. When the plane doors closed and the safety briefing began, she whispered into her phone on a voice note, "I can't believe who they're letting into first class now. I swear, standards are gone." The man heard every word. He didn't turn. He didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, breathing evenly, as if preparing for something much larger than a flight. As the plane began to taxi, the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard." Elaine barely listened. Her attention was fixed on the man beside her, who calmly adjusted his seat and stared out the window. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he was flying to San Francisco. She didn't know that by the time this flight landed, her assumptions would cost her far more than embarrassment. And she definitely didn't know that the quiet man in seat 4A was about to become the most expensive mistake of her career. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime, and the cabin shifted from restraint to routine. First class always transformed at this moment. Jackets loosened. Laptops emerged. People leaned into the comfort they believed they had earned. Elaine Parker straightened in her seat as if preparing to be served, not just food, but confirmation of her status. She glanced sideways again at the man in seat 4A. He was still looking out the window, the city shrinking beneath the clouds, expression unreadable. The first flight attendant returned with a practiced smile, pushing the drink cart slowly down the aisle. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said. "May I start you off with a beverage?" Elaine didn't wait her turn. "Champagne," she said crisply, not looking at the attendant, her eyes fixed on the man beside her as if daring the universe to correct her. The attendant nodded and poured. The glass sparkled under the cabin lights. When the attendant turned to the man in seat 4A, Elaine spoke again, her tone sharp but masked as curiosity. "Do you even drink champagne?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. A few heads turned. The man finally shifted his gaze from the window and looked at her. His eyes were calm, steady, almost curious. "Sometimes," he said. "Sparkling water today, please." The attendant smiled again, wider this time, and reached for the bottle. Elaine noticed. Again. As the cart rolled forward, Elaine leaned back, exhaling loudly. "Unreal," she muttered. "They don't even vet people anymore." The man didn't respond. He placed his hands neatly on the armrests and stared forward. Silence stretched. Elaine hated silence when she felt ignored. Silence meant she wasn't in control of the narrative. The meal service began shortly after. Linen tablecloths. Real cutlery. Options read aloud with care. When the attendant asked the man for a selection, Elaine interrupted again. "Are you sure he ordered first class?" she asked, smiling tightly. The attendant paused, her expression hardening just a fraction. "Yes, ma'am," she replied. "He did." Elaine laughed lightly, but there was no humor in it. "Well," she said, "I suppose miracles do happen." A businessman across the aisle cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Another passenger shifted in her seat. The atmosphere thickened. The man in seat 4A finally turned his head fully toward Elaine. Not angry, not defensive, just present. "Is there something you need?" he asked quietly. His voice carried just enough to be heard by those nearby. Elaine blinked, momentarily thrown off. She hadn't expected him to speak directly. "I need to feel comfortable on this flight," she said. "And frankly, I don't." "That's unfortunate," he replied calmly. Then he turned away. That was it. No argument. No apology. Elaine felt heat rush to her face. She wanted escalation. She wanted justification. She got dismissal. The attendant returned with their meals. As she placed the man's tray down carefully, Elaine leaned back too far in her seat, her elbow nudging her champagne glass. It tipped. Slowly. Deliberately enough to look like an accident, but controlled enough to aim. The pale gold liquid spilled across the edge of the tray and splashed onto the man's sleeve. A collective inhale rippled through the cabin. Elaine gasped theatrically. "Oh no," she said. "How clumsy of me." The man looked down at his sleeve. Wet. Sticky. He lifted it slightly, examining the spill. Then he reached for a napkin and dabbed at it, methodical, unhurried. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her. He didn't even look at her right away. That reaction unsettled Elaine far more than anger would have. "You should be more careful," she said pointedly. "These seats aren't cheap." The attendant stepped in immediately. "Sir, I'm so sorry," she said. "Let me help with that." She glared briefly at Elaine, just long enough for it to register. "Ma'am," she added, "please be mindful." Elaine scoffed. "It was an accident," she said. "These things happen." The man finally looked up at Elaine again. His eyes were steady, but something had shifted behind them. "Yes," he said quietly. "They do." He turned back to the attendant. "It's fine," he added. "No need to make a scene." Elaine smiled, triumphant. She believed she had won something. She didn't realize she had just crossed from assumption into record. A passenger 2 rows back pressed the call button discreetly. Another whispered to her seatmate. The cabin had chosen sides without saying it out loud. Elaine sensed it, but refused to acknowledge it. Power, she believed, came from insisting reality matched her expectations. The man in seat 4A believed power came from letting reality speak for itself. As the flight settled into cruising altitude, Elaine leaned back, satisfied. The man cleaned his sleeve and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. But internally, he had already marked the moment.
Time.
Seat number. Witnesses. Not out of spite. Out of habit. He had learned long ago that patience, paired with documentation, always outlasted arrogance. Elaine didn't see that. She saw only a quiet man who refused to fight back. She mistook restraint for weakness. And that mistake was growing heavier by the minute. The plane had settled into cruising altitude, but the tension in first class refused to level out. It lingered in the air like static, invisible yet unmistakable. Elaine Parker sat rigid in her seat, champagne refilled, posture stiff with self-satisfaction. Across from her, the man in seat 4A finished his meal quietly, his movements controlled, his presence calm. But calm, Elaine had learned, could feel threatening when it didn't bow. She leaned toward the aisle and caught the attention of another flight attendant, a senior one this time, her uniform sharper, her demeanor less forgiving. "Excuse me," Elaine said loudly enough for several rows to hear. "I need to speak to someone in charge." The attendant paused. "I am," she replied. Elaine gestured vaguely toward the man beside her. "I'm uncomfortable," she said again. "He's been staring. And earlier there was an incident with my drink." The attendant looked at the man in seat 4A, then back at Elaine. "Sir," she asked evenly, "is everything all right on your end?" He nodded once. "Yes," he said. "I'm fine. No complaint. No accusation." Elaine scoffed. "Of course he says that," she muttered. "He knows how this works." A murmur rippled through the nearby seats. People had stopped pretending not to notice. A woman across the aisle folded her arms. A businessman leaned back, eyes narrowed. Elaine felt the attention and leaned into it instead of retreating. "I just don't think it's appropriate," she continued, "to see people like this in first class without proper screening." The words landed hard. Too hard. The senior attendant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am," she said calmly, "all our passengers are screened equally." Elaine laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Sure they are." That was the moment. The moment the cabin shifted from passive discomfort to quiet judgment. Elaine didn't hear it. She was too busy proving a point no one had asked her to make. The man in seat 4A finally turned fully toward the attendant. "May I ask," he said politely, "if you'd like me to move?" Elaine's eyes lit up. "Yes," she said immediately. "That would be best." The attendant hesitated. She looked at him closely now, not as a problem, but as a person. "Sir," she replied, "you are not required to move." He nodded. "I understand," he said. "I just want the flight to be peaceful." Elaine threw her hands up. "Unbelievable," she said. "He causes the issue and now he's playing the victim." The man didn't respond. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it calmly. He didn't record. He didn't point it at anyone. He simply checked the time. The senior attendant noticed. Her eyes flicked to his screen briefly, then back to Elaine. "Ma'am," she said firmly now, "I'm going to need you to lower your voice." Elaine stared at her. "Are you serious?" she demanded. "He's the one making me uncomfortable." The attendant didn't argue. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notepad. "For the record," she said evenly, "I need to document this interaction." Elaine froze. "Document," she repeated. "For what?" The attendant looked her in the eye. "For the flight log." Something in Elaine's expression flickered. Just for a second. Then she recovered. Fine, she said coldly. Document whatever you want. The attendant wrote.
Time.
Seat numbers. Brief description. Nearby passengers watched silently. The man in seat 4A watched too, not with satisfaction but with recognition. This was the turn. This was when arrogance stopped being noise and became evidence. As the attendant stepped away, Elaine leaned closer to him again. You think you won something? She whispered. People like you always think silence makes you noble. He finally met her gaze again, fully this time. No, he said quietly. I think silence makes things clear. Elaine laughed nervously. We'll see, she said. We'll see how clear it is when we land. The rest of the cabin pretended to return to normal. Trays were cleared. Lights dimmed slightly. But everyone knew something had shifted. The unspoken rule of first class, that conflict stayed discreet, had been broken. And once broken, it couldn't be repaired midair. The man in seat 4A leaned back, eyes closed, as if resting. But his mind was alert. He had no intention of escalating. He didn't need to. The system was already moving, quietly, exactly as designed. Elaine, unaware, sipped her champagne and smiled to herself, convinced she was still in control. She wasn't. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the long stretch of flight ahead, but whatever calm that usually brought never arrived. Elaine Parker sat rigid, eyes forward, jaw tight. She could feel it now, the subtle shift in the room. People weren't avoiding her gaze anymore. They were watching her. That wasn't how first class was supposed to work. Attention was meant to orbit people like her, not question them. She adjusted her coat, then leaned forward abruptly, pressing the call button again. The chimes sounded louder than it should have. A different attendant approached this time, younger, cautious. Yes, ma'am? Elaine didn't lower her voice. I want to formally complain, she said. This passenger, she gestured sharply toward the man in seat 4A, has been disruptive since boarding. The word disruptive hung there, unsupported by reality. A businessman 2 rows back frowned. A woman across the aisle shook her head slightly. The attendant glanced toward the senior crew member at the front of the cabin, uncertainty written on her face. I'll notify the lead, she said quietly, and stepped away. Elaine turned toward the man again, emboldened. You really think you can sit there and act untouchable? She said. People like you rely on everyone else being polite. He opened his eyes slowly. No, he replied. I rely on people being honest. That answer cut sharper than any insult. Elaine laughed, but it came out strained. Honest, she said. You don't even belong here. The words landed like a dropped tray. A visible reaction rippled through the cabin. The man beside Elaine stiffened. A woman near the window gasped softly. Even Elaine seemed surprised she'd said it out loud. The man in seat 4A didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean in. He simply said, That's not for you to decide. The lead flight attendant arrived moments later, her presence commanding immediate silence. What seems to be the issue? She asked. Elaine spoke quickly, her voice sharpened by frustration. This man has been making me uncomfortable since we boarded. I've asked repeatedly for help, and nothing has been done. The attendant looked at the man. He met her eyes calmly. I've remained seated, he said. I've spoken only when addressed. I've made no complaint. The attendant nodded once. Then she looked around. Did anyone witness the interaction? She asked. For a second, no one moved. Then the businessman 2 rows back raised his hand slightly. Yes, he said. I did. A woman across the aisle followed.
So did I, she added.
Elaine's eyes widened. This is ridiculous, she snapped. They don't know the full story. The attendant listened to the witnesses quietly, nodding as each spoke. When they finished, she turned back to Elaine. Her voice was calm, but firm. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop addressing this passenger. Elaine stared at her. Or what? She challenged.
The question was a mistake.
The attendant didn't rise to it. Or this will be escalated further, she said evenly. And it will be documented in full. The man in seat 4A remained silent, hands folded, eyes forward. Elaine felt something slip, control, maybe, or certainty. She scoffed and turned away, muttering under her breath. But the damage was done. The cabin no longer saw a confident woman asserting comfort. They saw someone exposed by her own words. As the attendant stepped away to the front of the cabin, she spoke quietly into the intercom phone. Codes were exchanged. Procedures activated. Elaine didn't hear them, but she felt the weight of them settling into place. This was no longer a personal dispute. It was an official matter. The man in seat 4A finally allowed himself a slow breath out. Not relief. Alignment. Everything was unfolding exactly as he expected. He hadn't needed to explain himself. He hadn't needed to prove anything. The moment Elaine crossed that line publicly, the system took over. Elaine leaned back, arms crossed tightly, staring straight ahead. She told herself she was still right. She told herself money and confidence always won in the end. But a seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. For the first time since boarding, she wondered, not loudly, not defensively, but quietly, what she might have misjudged. And that question would not leave her alone. The tone of the cabin changed the moment the lead flight attendant stepped into the galley and closed the curtain behind her. Elaine Parker didn't hear what was said, but she recognized the posture. Straight spine. Lowered voice. No gestures. That wasn't customer service anymore. That was procedure. She had seen it before in boardrooms when HR was called into meetings that were supposed to be informal. The man in seat 4A noticed it too. He didn't react. He had already moved past the point of reaction. Minutes passed. The hum of the engines filled the space where conversation used to live. Elaine shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs. She glanced around, hoping to find support in the faces nearby. She didn't. People avoided her eyes now. The room had made its decision, and it wasn't waiting for her approval. She leaned toward the aisle again, pressing the call button with less confidence than before. When the attendant returned, Elaine didn't waste time. "I want to know what's being done about this," she said. Her voice was controlled, but the edge was unmistakable. The attendant met her gaze evenly. "The situation has been escalated to the captain," she replied. Elaine blinked. "The captain?" she repeated. "For what?" The attendant didn't answer directly.
"For review," she said.
"And for the flight record." That word again. Record. Elaine felt a tightening in her chest. "This is absurd," she said. "He's the one causing the disruption." The attendant didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply said, "Please remain seated and refrain from further comments toward other passengers." Elaine stared at her, stunned. She wasn't used to being instructed. Not like this. Not publicly. Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken earlier shifted in his seat and looked away. A woman near the window pretended to read, though her eyes flicked up every few seconds. The man in seat 4A remained still, his face neutral, his hands folded. Elaine hated that most of all. She wanted him to acknowledge the tension, to flinch, to look nervous. He didn't. It felt like arguing with a wall that was quietly documenting every word. The intercom crackled softly. Not an announcement. A private channel. Elaine didn't hear the conversation, but she saw the lead attendant nod as she listened.
Once.
Then twice. When she turned back toward the cabin, her expression was resolute. This was no longer about comfort. It was about conduct. Elaine leaned toward the man again, lowering her voice. "You think you're clever," she whispered. "Playing innocent. Letting them fight your battles." He didn't look at her. "No," he said quietly. "I'm letting them do their jobs." That answer hit harder than any insult. Elaine opened her mouth to respond, then stopped herself. For the first time since boarding, she sensed that speaking might make things worse. The attendant returned with a small tablet and made a note.
Time. Seat. Summary.
Elaine watched the movement of the stylus like it was a blade. "What exactly are you writing?" she demanded. The attendant looked up calmly. "An objective account," she replied, "based on observed behavior and passenger reports." Elaine laughed bitterly. "Objective," she scoffed. "This whole thing is biased." The attendant didn't respond. She finished the note and locked the screen. The man in seat 4A glanced briefly at the tablet, then back out the window. Somewhere below them, The country stretched endlessly, indifferent to ego and assumptions. Elaine suddenly felt very small in her expensive seat. Not powerless, yet, but no longer protected by the invisible shield she had always relied on. The realization unsettled her more than anger ever had. When the attendant finally stepped away, Elaine sat back, arms crossed, jaw clenched. She told herself this would blow over. That nothing serious ever came from a mid-flight complaint. That people like her always landed on their feet. But the plane moved steadily forward, and with every mile, the situation solidified. Flight logs didn't disappear. Reports didn't evaporate. And once the captain was involved, there was no undoing the chain of events. The man in seat 4A closed his eyes again, not to rest, but to wait. He knew the pattern. He had lived it before. Elaine had mistaken access for authority, volume for control. The system didn't care about her confidence. It cared about facts. And facts, once written, were stubborn things. By the time the cabin lights dimmed further and the flight settled into its long stretch, Elaine understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever happened next would not be decided by her tone, her money, or her insistence. It would be decided somewhere else, by people who had never met her, reading words she could no longer erase. And the flight wasn't even halfway over. The captain's voice came through the speakers with practiced calm, announcing their descent.
Seat backs upright.
Trays stowed. Cabin secured. For most passengers, it was a routine cue. For Elaine Parker, it felt like a countdown. She sat rigid, eyes fixed forward, replaying the last hours in her head, searching for a version where she still controlled the ending. None appeared. The lead flight attendant moved through first class with quiet efficiency, checking belts, exchanging brief nods with her crew. When she reached row 4, her eyes lingered on Elaine for a fraction of a second longer than protocol required. No accusation. No warmth. Just acknowledgement. Elaine noticed. Her throat tightened. The man in seat 4A adjusted his seat and buckled in without comment. He looked calm, but he was alert. He knew the choreography that followed incidents like this, how information traveled ahead of the plane, how ground teams prepared before the wheels touched down. He had seen it from different angles in different roles. This time, he was simply a passenger. That was enough. As the plane dipped lower, Elaine leaned toward him again, unable to help herself. "You think this ends well for you?" she whispered. "You think they won't question you?" He didn't turn. "They can," he said quietly. "Questions don't bother me." Elaine scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. She looked toward the front of the cabin, where the lead attendant was speaking softly into a handset, her body angled away from the passengers.
Codes.
Confirmations. Elaine couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the posture. This was coordination. The landing was smooth. Polite applause scattered through the cabin. The plane rolled to the gate and stopped. The seatbelt sign stayed on longer than usual. Elaine noticed immediately. People exchanged glances. The engines powered down. The doors remained closed. Time stretched. The lead attendant stepped into the aisle and spoke clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a moment." The request was calm, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. Elaine's heart began to pound. This wasn't normal. She leaned forward, gripping the armrests. The man in seat 4A remained seated, hands resting lightly on his knees. He looked neither relieved nor tense. He was waiting. Footsteps sounded outside the aircraft. The door opened. 2 airline supervisors stepped in, badges visible, expressions neutral. The cabin went silent. They spoke briefly with the lead attendant, then turned their attention down the aisle. "Miss Parker," one of them said politely. Elaine's head snapped up. "Yes," she replied, forcing a smile. "We need to ask you a few questions regarding an in-flight incident," the supervisor continued. "It will only take a moment." Elaine glanced around, suddenly aware of every eye on her. "Is this really necessary?" she asked. "I've already explained everything." The supervisor nodded. "We have the flight log," he said evenly. "And statements." Elaine's smile faltered. "Statements," she repeated. The second supervisor turned to the man in seat 4A. "Sir," he said respectfully, "thank you for your patience. You're free to deplane when the aisle clears." Elaine stared. "Free to?" she began, but the words died in her mouth. Passengers were released row by row. People passed Elaine slowly now, not rushing, pretending not to stare. She felt exposed in a way she hadn't since her earliest days in the industry. The man in seat 4A stood, retrieved his bag, and nodded once to the supervisors. No triumph. No glance back. He walked down the jet bridge and disappeared into the terminal. Elaine remained seated, heart racing. The supervisors waited until the cabin was nearly empty. "Miss Parker," one said gently, "we'll need to document your account before you exit." Elaine swallowed. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. The supervisor didn't answer directly. "We're completing a report," he said. "It will be reviewed."
Reviewed.
That word again. Elaine nodded stiffly and stood, legs unsteady. As she walked toward the door, the cabin that had once affirmed her status now felt like a courtroom she had lost control of. She stepped into the jet bridge, where the noise of the terminal rushed in, indifferent and loud. Somewhere ahead, the man in seat 4A moved through the airport like any other traveler, blending into the crowd. Elaine watched the space where he had been and felt a chill that had nothing to do with air conditioning. She finally understood what she had mistaken all along. The flight hadn't been the event. It had been the record. And records traveled far. Elaine Parker's phone began vibrating before she even reached baggage claim. Not a friendly buzz.
Not a casual check-in.
This was the sharp, relentless kind that meant something had moved without her consent. She ignored the first call, then the second. By the third, she stopped walking. People streamed past her, rolling suitcases, reuniting with families, living lives that hadn't just cracked open midair. She answered. "Where are you?" the voice demanded. It was her managing director. No greeting. No patience. Elaine straightened instinctively. "I just landed," she replied. "What's going on?" There was a pause, brief, controlled, dangerous. "We received an incident notice," he said, "from the airline." Elaine's stomach dropped. "An incident notice?" she repeated. It was nothing. A misunderstanding. The silence on the other end stretched. "We'll talk upstairs," he said.
Now.
Across the terminal, the man from seat 4A walked calmly toward the exit. A man in a tailored suit approached him near the private car service area. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "Your driver is waiting." The man nodded, thanked him, and followed without drawing attention. To anyone watching, it looked ordinary. Elaine saw it anyway. Her eyes narrowed. Something about that exchange felt practiced, professional, not the movement of someone lucky to be there. Elaine's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification. Subject: Immediate review required. The sender was legal. She opened it with shaking hands. "We have been informed of a conduct report logged during your recent flight. Please provide a written account immediately. All client-facing activities are temporarily paused pending review." Temporarily paused. Elaine felt her throat tighten. That phrase didn't mean temporary. It meant controlled. She arrived at her firm's glass tower less than an hour later. The lobby that usually felt like home now felt sterile. Her assistant stood as she approached, eyes wide, voice low. "They're waiting," she whispered. Elaine nodded and walked toward the conference room, heels clicking louder than usual. Inside, 3 people sat at the table. Legal, HR, and a senior partner she rarely saw outside of major decisions. They didn't offer her a seat. She sat anyway. The legal counsel slid a document across the table. Airline letterhead, time stamps, seat numbers. A concise summary of events written in neutral language. Elaine skimmed it quickly, her pulse pounding. It didn't read like an accusation. That was worse. It read like a record. "Do you know the passenger involved?" the partner asked. Elaine shook her head. "No," she said. "He was just someone seated next to me." The partner nodded slowly. "His name is on the report," he said. He tapped the page. Elaine's eyes followed. The name registered instantly. Her breath caught.
She knew that name.
Everyone in her industry did. Not from headlines. From deal rooms. From quiet influence. From decisions that reshaped companies without press releases. The man from seat 4A wasn't just a passenger. He was a principal partner at a firm currently in late-stage talks with one of Elaine's largest clients. The room shifted. That deal is sensitive, the partner continued evenly. And perception matters. Elaine opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again.
I didn't know, she said.
I swear, I didn't know who he was. Legal leaned forward. The report isn't about who he is, she said calmly. It's about what was said. And how it was said. Across the city, the man from seat 4A sat in the back of a quiet car, scrolling through his phone. A message from his legal team confirmed what he already expected. Airline log received by multiple corporate compliance desks. No action required from you. He read it once, then locked the screen. He hadn't complained. He hadn't asked. He had simply allowed the process to unfold. Elaine sat frozen as the implications settled in. Deals didn't collapse overnight. They slowed. They questioned. They reassessed risk. And right now, she was risk. We need to insulate the firm, the partner said. Which means you'll be stepping back until this is resolved. Elaine nodded, numb. Stepping back. Another phrase that never meant what it sounded like. As she left the conference room, her phone buzzed again. A calendar update. Client strategy call, reassigned. Elaine stared at the screen. She finally understood. The man in seat 4A hadn't needed to reveal himself. His name had traveled ahead of him. Quietly. Efficiently. Just like the record she could no longer control. And the fallout was only beginning. Elaine Parker didn't hear the whispers at first. She felt them. They arrived as pauses, half-beats where conversations used to flow, gaps where her name once opened doors. On Monday morning, she walked into the office expecting friction, maybe a confrontation she could manage. Instead, she was met with distance. Smiles that ended too quickly. Eyes that slid away before contact. Silence that wasn't empty, but deliberate. Her calendar told the story before anyone did. A keynote she had been announced for weeks earlier now listed a different moderator. A client lunch turned into an internal alignment session she wasn't invited to. She refreshed her inbox twice, then a third time, as if the messages might correct themselves. They didn't. Silence had become a warning. In a glass conference room across the floor, partners spoke in low voices. Elaine caught fragments as she passed: risk posture, optics, unforced exposure. Words she had used countless times about other people. Now they were orbiting her. She paused outside the room, hand hovering near the door, then kept walking. She already knew what she'd hear. By midweek, the industry newsletter arrived. Not a headline. A paragraph buried near the middle. Several firms are quietly reviewing executive conduct following recent in-flight incident logs shared through airline compliance channels. No names. No accusations. Just enough specificity to land where it needed to. Elaine read it twice. The second time, her hands shook. Phones stopped ringing. Emails slowed. Not abruptly. Professionals didn't do abrupt, but noticeably. When Elaine tried to schedule a catch-up with a long-time client, the assistant replied with a polite deferral. Let's circle back next quarter. Quarter was a lifetime in her world. She closed the email and stared at the city through the window, realizing something irreversible had begun. Across town, the man from seat 4A reviewed a deck with his team. Numbers. Timelines. Clean lines. No one mentioned the flight. They didn't need to. The system had absorbed it already. His legal counsel summarized calmly. Multiple desks received the airline log. No exposure on our side. Monitoring only. He nodded once. Monitoring was enough. Intervention wasn't required when alignment existed. Back at Elaine's firm, HR scheduled a follow-up. Not a reprimand.
A review.
The language was careful, almost kind. We want to understand response patterns. Patterns. That word again. Elaine answered questions she hadn't practiced for. How she handled public discomfort. How she de-escalated tension. She realized too late that confidence, without reflection, read differently on paper. By Friday, the change was visible to everyone. Elaine was still employed, still titled, still present. But she wasn't central anymore. Decisions happened without her. Calls concluded before she joined. When she spoke in meetings, people listened politely and moved on. Visibility wasn't taken from her. It evaporated. That evening, she walked past the airport on her way home, watching planes lift into the dark. She thought about the moment she'd tipped the glass, the words she'd chosen, the certainty that had felt so justified then. She hadn't lost anything in the air. She had revealed something. And revelation, once documented, didn't fade. The man from seat 4A boarded another flight that night. Different city. Same routine. He sat, buckled, and opened a report. A minor dispute a few rows back was handled cleanly, documented, resolved, done. He watched without judgment. The system worked because no one tried to overpower it. Elaine understood now what she had mistaken all along. Silence wasn't weakness. Silence was capacity, the ability to let structures speak. And structures, once engaged, didn't argue. They concluded. By the time she reached her apartment, her phone buzzed with one last update. Client portfolio reassigned. She set the phone down and didn't pick it up again. The whispers had finished their work. What remained was distance, measured, professional, and final. Elaine Parker knew the decision had already been made before the meeting was scheduled. She felt it in the way the calendar invite was written. Neutral language, limited attendees, no agenda attached. Those meetings never asked questions. They closed chapters. She arrived early, anyway. Old habits die hard. The conference room was smaller than the one she usually used for client briefings. No skyline view. No glass walls. Just a table for chairs and a screen turned off. Legal sat on one side. HR on the other. The senior partner entered last, carrying nothing but a thin folder. Elaine noticed that immediately. Big outcomes never needed big binders. They didn't waste time. The partner spoke first. "We've completed our review," he said evenly. Elaine nodded, hands folded, posture perfect. She had practiced calm her entire career. "This is not a finding of misconduct," he continued. "It is a determination of risk." The distinction mattered. It protected the firm. It offered her no shelter. HR slid a document across the table. Role adjustment and transition plan. Elaine scanned the page quickly. Words like effective immediately and external-facing responsibilities jumped out. She stopped reading. "So I'm being removed," she said. Not angry. Just precise. The partner nodded. "You're being transitioned," he replied. Elaine almost smiled. Language was such a careful thing. She looked up. "Because of the flight," she said. Legal answered this time. "Because of the response," she said calmly. The flight was the context. Elaine closed her eyes for half a second. That was the truth she had been circling for weeks without landing on. Context versus response. The difference between an accident and a pattern. The meeting ended the way all clean endings do, politely, efficiently, without ceremony. Elaine packed her things quietly. Awards. Framed photos. Business cards she would no longer need. A junior associate passed by the doorway and paused. "Take care," she said softly. Elaine nodded. No bitterness. Just acknowledgement. Outside, the city moved the way it always had. Indifferent. Elaine walked to her car, heels clicking, then stopped. For the first time in years, there was nowhere she needed to be immediately. The absence was startling. She sat behind the wheel and didn't start the engine. Across the country, the man from seat 4A reviewed a final update from his team. All matters resolved. No further monitoring required. He archived the message and moved on to the next item. There was no satisfaction in it. Just completion. He hadn't won anything. He had simply allowed a process to conclude. That evening, Elaine sat alone in her apartment, lights low, phone face down. She replayed the flight again. Not defensively this time. Honestly. The words. The assumptions. The way she had leaned into authority instead of restraint. She finally saw it clearly. Power had never been the problem. Her relationship to it had been. She opened a notebook she hadn't touched in years and wrote one sentence. I confused being heard with being right. She stared at it for a long time, then added another, and I confused control with safety. The realization hurt, but it was clean. No anger, no denial, just truth, arriving late but intact. The room had moved on without her. And for the first time, she understood why. 6 months passed without announcements, without apologies, without explanations owed to anyone but themselves. Life didn't reset. It recalibrated. Elaine Parker no longer rushed through glass lobbies or measured her days by deal flow. Her mornings were quieter now. No assistant waiting with updates. No calendar packed with leverage. She worked, consulting, advising, listening, but without the authority she once carried like armor. People didn't move when she entered a room anymore. And strangely, that taught her more than power ever had. One afternoon, she boarded a flight from Boston to Chicago. Not first class. She hadn't booked it that way. She didn't need to. She found her seat, stowed her bag, and sat down without expectation. The cabin filled slowly. Ordinary people. Ordinary noise. No hierarchy announced itself. She watched a flight attendant help an elderly man with his seatbelt, patient and calm, and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Respect, she realized, wasn't assigned by Rose. A few seats away, a minor disagreement flared over overhead space. It ended quickly.
Documented.
Resolved.
Done.
Elaine noticed how no one tried to dominate the moment. The system worked because no one fought it. She smiled faintly, recognizing the pattern she had once resisted. Across the country, the man from seat 4A boarded another flight. Different airline. Different city. Same calm. He sat, buckled in, and opened a report. He wasn't thinking about Elaine Parker. He wasn't thinking about the flight that started it all. He was thinking about alignment, how small moments, when left uninterrupted, corrected themselves. That was the real power. Letting structures do their work. The plane lifted. Cities shrank into constellations of light. Thousands of lives moved through the sky, each carrying assumptions, habits, and choices that would never make headlines. Most moments passed unnoticed. Some didn't. The difference wasn't volume. It was response. Elaine looked out her window as the clouds closed in beneath the wing. She thought about the seat she once believed defined her, the confidence that had felt unshakable, the silence she had mistaken for weakness. She didn't regret the lesson. She regretted how long it took to listen. The cabin lights dimmed. A flight attendant passed and smiled. Elaine returned it, naturally this time, without calculation. Somewhere above the clouds, the world kept moving, indifferent to titles, patient with patterns. Consequences didn't arrive loudly. They arrived accurately. And that was enough.